The next few sessions will focus on different aspects of election integrity, including falsehoods about the process and results of elections, collective civil society efforts to safeguard election participation, and finally, evidence as well as perceptions of foreign influence in elections. Elections are a focal point for this community because, one, they are big, easy targets with outsized returns for bad actors. Two, they are time-bound events with outsized attention. And three, they are a foundational process for democratic societies requiring common purpose as well as a shared set of facts. We turn now to Alex Stamos and Isabella Garcia Camargo to discuss the collective effort of our election integrity partnership over the last year here in the United States.
Hi, I'm Alex Stamos, the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory. I wanted to talk to you today about a project that we were part of called the Election Integrity Partnership. Last year, about 120 researchers from Stanford, the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, Graphica, and the Atlantic Council DFR Lab worked together to study disinformation that was being spread before and during and after the US election. What we'd like to do is talk a little bit about how this partnership came about, how it operated, and some of our top level findings. You can find all of the detailed findings that we'll talk about today at eipartnership.net. Next slide, please. The Election Integrity Partnership started with our team at Stanford sending a group of interns to go work with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS to work on election security. And while these interns found that there was a lot of opportunity for them to contribute to the technical components of election security, they also found that there was a lack of capability around election disinformation. This is not because CISA didn't care about disinformation, but at the time they lacked both kind of the funding and the legal authorizations to go do the kinds of work that would be necessary to truly understand how election disinformation was operating. So because of the feedback and the ideas from this group, we were able to pull together pretty quickly a project between these four different institutions to try to fill the gap of the things that the government could not do themselves. There are kind of four major stakeholders that we operated with that we worked beside at EIP. Our partners in government, most particularly those in CISA, DHS, but also in all the local and state governments with whom we operated with the election integrity infrastructure ISAC. We worked with civil society groups such as the NAACP, MITRE, Common Cause, and the Healthy Elections Project that worked at both MIT and Stanford. And then we also worked with the major platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, Nextdoor, and the like. In some of those cases, we had agreements for access to data. In other cases, we had to have individual analysts go work with them. If we go back to the outline of what the flow was here, the idea was that we would have teams inside of the companies, inside of the EIP, that would take data that we were pulling from the social media networks. We would find examples of election disinformation. Our first tier of analysts would go look, see whether the claims were true or not, or were doubtful and needed to be verified, would classify them on our levels of different categories and prioritization. And then those would go to a second tier of analysts who would look to see whether that disinformation was part of a larger push or theme. And then there's a bunch of different outcomes. Those outcomes could include us reporting election disinformation to the platforms to be actioned under their own policies. It could be us doing a public announcement. It could be us working side by side with our partners in local and state election. Let's go to the example slide where we talk about a specific example of this. So for example, on election day itself, we detected that there was a young man who had made a claim on Instagram that he was part of throwing the election and burning ballots for President Trump. A screenshot was taken of this before he deleted this Instagram story and then was spread on Twitter and Facebook as being an actual claim. This seemed highly unlikely to us that this claim was true. So we found this on Twitter and Facebook. We pulled that information down. We referred it to Twitter and Facebook. As you can see here, they were asking for evidence that this was actually not true. We were able to operate through the Election Integrity ISAC and reach out to the officials in Erie, Pennsylvania. We spoke to them directly, and they confirmed to us that the person that was making this claim was not a volunteer or employee, and that the things that he was claiming were absolutely untrue. Because of that, these companies then took down this disinformation, and there was an official release from the election officials in Erie, Pennsylvania, to try to debunk this erroneous claim. So this is exactly the kind of thing we did over and over again, thousands of times in the lead up to the election, on election day, and for about a month afterwards. The other things we did is we gathered up all of these examples so that we could do a deeper analysis afterwards. And for that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Isabella Garcia Camargo. Isabella was a student at Stanford during this and operated as the program manager for the EIP overall, and was a totally integral part. She was also one of those interns at CISA who came up with the original idea of the EIP. Go ahead, Isabella. We're looking forward to hearing about the findings.
Great, thank you, Alex. So as Alex mentioned, the thousands of examples of one of these cases of narrative going from an individual post to a widespread theory online are encapsulated in our final report, which is called The Long Fuse. It's over 300 pages, which really goes over both the narratives as well as the tactics and social media policies, which contributed to the story of the 2020 election landscape. I'm going to be giving a sampling of one of our findings to encourage really audience members to check out this full work of over 100 researchers. So one of the most important dynamics that we observed in the 2020 elections was the participatory nature of these narratives. Content was going both top down, so from large political influencers and media lights, as well as bottom up, from a politically charged crowd that was influenced starting in the summer of 2020 to look for evidence of electioneering and cheating and gather that evidence in online spaces in order to come to this collective sense-making process towards what eventually became the Stop the Steal movement and this widespread theory that the election was stolen. So one of the clearest examples of this was in the case of Sharpiegate. This was a prominent narrative, which was part of the Stop the Steal movement, in which there was a theory that specifically Trump voters had been disenfranchised by being forced to use Sharpies at the polling stations. This theory was quickly debunked by the election departments, which were in question. In most cases, ballots were designed to be used with Sharpie pens. However, that didn't stop the narrative from spreading widely on and after election day. And what's really interesting is to dive into the actual data, which our researchers were finding in real time on election day. So initially there were concerns not only in Arizona, where Sharpiegate really kind of came to a helm, but also in states where the ballot stations closed even earlier. So we saw examples of this in Connecticut as well as in Minnesota. But eventually when this moved into Arizona, we saw the most clear evidence of concern moving towards suspicion. So individuals who were questioning, why they were given Sharpies themselves personally, and then seeing other users online and growing that questioning into a larger suspicion. This suspicion moved into accusation of real fraud and electioneering happening, especially in Maricopa County, Arizona. And then eventually all of this accumulated into offline action with real protests that night at the Maricopa County Elections Department, where voters were demanding to go see evidence of cheating or no cheating in the ballot counting, and had signs which used the hashtag Sharpiegate that was seeded just that morning. And these graphs are credit to the University of Washington team, which was crucial in finding these dynamics online, but we really saw this in the data. On the left, you can see the small dots representing individual users with initial reports of Sharpie issues. And then on the right, you see the larger influencers with larger audiences who picked up these initial reports and then amplified them to larger audiences. So really an example of this bottom-up participatory dynamic, which led to the spread of this narrative.
Thanks, Isabella. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things. So first off, we saw a big difference in the discussion of 2016 versus 2020, in that a lot of the concerns around disinformation in 2016 were focused on foreign interference, specifically interference from Russia. One of the things that we document in our report is that there is very few examples of foreign influence in 2020. One of the best examples was an attempt by groups aligned with the Iranian government to try to convince American voters that large amount of voter information was stolen and that was being used by the Proud Boys to create fake ballots to vote on behalf of President Trump. their efforts to make that a major story failed, partially because the video they released was debunked very, very quickly by a coalition of private and public entities, most famously with the director of the FBI, Chris Krebs, the director of CISA, and other executives standing on the podium of the White House saying this was not actually happening. So that was a very effective use of the public-private partnership to debunk and stop foreign interference. And when we look at these other themes, like Sharpiegate and such, we find very little evidence that there's any foreign involvement at all. In fact, the vast majority of election disinformation in 2020 came from Americans who had verified accounts and very large follower accounts. So that's one of the big changes that we point out in our report, is that disinformation is much less about massive amplification. It's honestly less about things like algorithms and algorithmic amplification. It's what a much more important factor now is that there are large follower account political partisans who are spreading misinformation intentionally, doing so in a multimedia context. So they're doing so online on social media, but they're also doing so on cable news, doing so on the radio, through a variety of different outlets, and are able to amplify their message and to motivate their followers to go try to find evidence of the incorrect claims that they're making. Where does this leave us for 2022 and 2024? So the Election Integrity Partnership was a project just for 2020. We are looking at options for these different groups to work together in the future elections, but there is going to have to be work in the federal government level to decide, one, who in the government is going to own disinformation as a problem. That is something that at least in the American domestic context, has not been figured out. And second, what kind of role should the academic and NGO sector play here? And one of the things we're gonna have to figure out is not just from a funding perspective, but from a privacy and data access perspective. One of the things that continues to happen is we continue to get tighter and tighter privacy laws being passed around access to online social media data. And as long as that is happening, we're gonna have to take into account those issues and the need for academic research when passing those laws. So this is something that we're going to continue to write about and talk about as we work with our partners to figure out how the same kind of function that the IP filled in 2020 can be filled by somebody in 2022 and 2024. Thank you very much for having us. It was great, and please enjoy the rest of your conference.